Vampires are something I have an extensive well of love for. They're lonely outsiders with goth makeup, existences tinged in sorrow. They're an exceptionally romantic piece in horror's arsenal of monsters. Their origins fascinate me. The classics like Dracula still retain cultural relevancy decades later, and people are consistently making new vampire stories that deliver on the promise on the sad but sultry blood-sucking beings we know and love. Alongside my love of vampires, manga is something I love even more, but despite these coexisting infatuations, the number of vampire manga I've read and know about is fairly slim. There's of course some heavy hitters everyone knows about, like Hellsing, Vampire Knight, or the newer Call of the Night, and JoJo Part 1 is something I talk about incessantly and I'm always down to express my love of. But I'll hold back on that today as I want to talk about some older vampire manga that I've been reading that aren't written by Hirohiko Araki. Everything I talk about in this video will have come out pre-2001, so pretty much everything before my birth, and as for why, it's pretty arbitrary. There are a few things I wanted to read that fit this time frame, but I also really love reading older manga, and I think the history of manga deserves more eyes on it. Everyone's so focused on the new big thing, as am I sometimes too, but it's fun to look back and see where everything originates from. What do the manga we love today take influence from? How has the medium grown? It's stuff like this that I love to observe. I also take a lot of joy in filling out my mental library on manga history and touching on classic authors who I've pretty much neglected over time, like Go Nagai or Osamu Tezuka. This is something I want to do more of, as well as discover other older authors I might not be familiar with. So if that sounds interesting to you and you'd like to hear more about some old vampire manga, then please join me as we go and explore some vampiric manga from years long past. Starting off, and we'll be doing this chronologically, we have the Poe Clan from 1972, an iconic shoujo manga by Moto Hagio, one of the most prolific and important mangaka ever who has been active since 1969. I won't really pretend I know much about Hagio other than a vague sense of their importance in shoujo manga's earlier years and from reading their brilliant one-shot, The Willow Tree, which I totally recommend checking out by the way. But I was very excited going into one of their classics, hoping it would be a gateway for me to read more of their manga in the future, which, spoilers, was the case as I'm currently reading Heart of Thomas while writing this script. The Poe Clan, though, is a story with a non-chronological narrative, set between centuries from 1744 to 1976, that details the story of the titular Poe Clan, a family of vampires who can seemingly live forever but must feed on the blood of the living to survive. Certain vampiric traits aren't present, like their complete aversion to sunlight, so there's a tad more normalcy to the manga and its stories. It is, first and foremost, though, a drama more than a horror, and delves into some of my favorite aspects and themes of vampires. The non-chronological way it was published really makes you think about and feel the passage of time. Something very relevant is not only do these vampires live long storied unlives, but do not age either. This is very important as our primary view into this world is one Edgar Portsnell, who joined the clan at the tender age of 14, which is the age he'll stay forever. This is a bit of a reoccurring subject within vampire media, and we'll visit it a few times in other manga today, but I adore its usage here in the Poe Clan. There's a romanticized aspect to it of being youthful and beautiful forever. Also, there's a big focus on Edgar as well as other vampires who inhabit child bodies living on as children for eternity, and how tragic that fate is. After Edgar is turned, he finds himself divorced from the world of the living and from his fellow vampires who are all much older, both physically and mentally, than he is. He is alone, and loneliness is at the core of the Poe Clan and Edgar's story. It causes Edgar to take actions which have a domino effect on the entire plot. Unable to be alone forever, he decides to turn others, the same age as himself, into vampires. But this only illuminates more issues, as now he must deal with the grief of knowing he has potentially served a fate worse than death onto others. One of which is his own sister, and the other her groom-to-be, Alan. Yet Edgar is perfectly sympathetic, and the Poe Clan is a series of highs and lows depicting the tortured yet beautiful existence of these child vampires. They never get to know people for long, always having to leave as they do not age. Conversely though, these moments aren't entirely tragic or devoid of meaning. The chapter 1 Week is a beautiful short story that sees Alan, divorced from Edgar for a short time, befriend 2 girls. In that time, he can be a child, he gets to play and make friends, but eventually this needs to end. It's sweet, a reprieve from the tragedy, and necessary in showing the lighter side to the Poe clan, as well as the earnest desire for Alan and Edgar to return to simpler times where they aren't alone and are accepted by all. Perhaps my favourite story I've read from the Poe clan builds on these ideas of loneliness and time and juxtaposes the long, eternally lonely lives of vampires with an ephemeral human one. Riddell within the forest sees Edgar and Alan look after a child as she grows up living with them fantastically throughout forests, divorced from society at large. She grows up enjoying her fairy tale life but soon realizes that she's growing larger and older and her current parents are not. And soon enough they must part as the 2 vampires realize that she shouldn't be doomed to the same fate as them. This is also told in media res, a recollection from a much older Riddell. It's a short story at about 16 pages long, and yet the feelings I got from reading it were very palpable. Moto Hagio manages to express so much through this character and through the use of contrast by showing how ephemeral our lives are, as well as how beautiful and heartbreaking existence itself is. They seem to walk out of legends, the couple who raised me. Who were they? From this summer to the next, always following newly bloomed roses, roaming in the forests. Who were they? They were always the same, only I was growing. So they left me. I was the only one growing older. I slept with the window open every day in order to stop growing. I wanted to die but didn't die and closed the window. Married. As time passed, I almost became a normal wife out of a normal family. I felt happy, living a busy but full life. But sometimes in the blissful days without a reason, I can't help myself, remembering those old days. I would often say, "Dear, when I was little I would live in the nests of birds, in a forest far away, raised by 2 beautiful birds." My husband never understood, only listened and smiled. Though Edgar and Alan never turned Riddell, they still impacted her in such a profound way, altering her life to the extent that there's a struggle to connect with her future loved ones. Meditating on this, I think it can say a lot about us as human beings and how we connect and feel estranged from one another. It's something vampire media tackles really well, as they're creatures who live on the fringes of humanity, human but not. You don't have to be a vampire to understand these stories or feel what they're trying to convey. I think it's a very human feeling to feel alone or apart, and this chapter of the Poe clan illustrates this aspect of our nature beautifully. Some lines from Riddell, like her mentioning her husband not understanding her, are soul-crushing, and the line, "I wanted to die but didn't die," hit me very hard. It's the want for things to stay as they are, for the good times to return, to stay young forever, or the want to die. We're at the mercy of time and we have no control. It's rather depressing, but plenty beautiful too, especially with all the natural imagery used here. The forest they lived in together, the roses, and the mention of Edgar and Alan being birds especially. The ephemeral is something Japan is especially intertwined with from my understanding, with the concept of mono no aware, or the pathos of things, being something you'll likely run into if you spend enough time reading up on Japanese media or history. This interest and ideology of finding beauty in things that do not last, of transient moments, feelings, or lives, fits hand in hand with vampires as beings who are eternal. They help highlight how precious our fleeting memories are by outliving us. I would be remiss before we move on not to spend some time talking about how beautiful the Poe clan is on an artistic front. My experience with shoujo manga is limited, but the Poe clan exhibits a lot of common elements that would permeate the demographic for years to come and become synonymous with its aesthetic. Firstly, flowers. This is something you'll see in a lot of shoujo manga, and I adore it. The story focuses on roses, with them being important for some narrative reasons, but visually they appear throughout the manga alongside other flowers, and I find their placement captivating. how they're used to frame panels or add detail. There's an extravagance and desire for the Poe Clan and other shoujo manga to escape the bounds of their comic form, to branch out, which lets pages be more illustrative, with panel elements being obscured by parts of a character or other elements like flowers. It's beautiful, there's no real other way of describing it for me, and I think all of these artistic flourishes, decisions, and the focus on natural elements like flowers really add to the manga's approach to beauty as a theme and life in general. Through the Poe Clan, Moto Hagio illustrates how much grief surrounds us just by being alive and present, but that also applies to a vampire's immortal life too. Yet we as humans, just like vampires, march forward, we're one and the same. Alongside the general grief of being alive, I think the Poe Clan touches on a specific subset of grief related to the outsider, of feeling left behind by the world, something I can empathize with a lot. Not only do vampires in the Poe Clan feel divorced from other humans due to their very being, but in the case of Edgar and Alan, they're branded as children forever, unable to become an adult. These are ostracized characters unable to enter the world of everyone else, the adult world, something I feel very much myself. I just don't fit in, everything makes me anxious, I'm expected to do or feel things I can't or don't feel. I don't feel like I belong in the boxes others put me in, and I think most of all I don't understand what being an adult means. I don't know how to grow up or experience life like everyone else seems to. In a weird way, I find comfort in the Poe Clan and vampire stories like it. I feel less lonely because I get to know that others before me have thought these exact same thoughts and have put them in story form. They've been alone too, they felt like the outsider and maybe grappled with these out-of-place feelings of being othered in a world full of adults. Through our combined loneliness and the sense that we are out of place in this world, it makes me think that perhaps there is no real order to things. The distinction between what an adult is too nebulous, that instead we live in chaos, we live in something beautiful, painful, and fleeting. I'm not sure why exactly, as it sounds quite scary, but I find that quite calming sometimes, or at least within the moments of calm, I can appreciate everything much more. These are the thoughts the Poe Clan inspires within me when I read it. There is so much I could say about the Poe Clan, and this is me ignoring the whole boys love angle or shonen ai elements that the Poe Clan has helped pioneer in early shoujo manga. It's such a titanic work for manga history that quite honestly deserves whole videos devoted to it, and partly why I'm not discussing it more is because I haven't even read it all. Through reading some scans, I figured out it actually has an official English translation. Whoops. Though I promptly stopped reading because one day I'd like to read it all for myself in its beautiful hardcover format. The problem is though, I don't really have enough money to buy it. But if you would like to support my endeavors on making videos on manga like this and would like to aid your silly vampiric host here, please head over to my Patreon and donate some money or blood, metaphorically anyway, so I can eat and keep making cool stuff, and maybe one day I'll be able to even buy the Poe Clan physically and make another video on it. You'll also get a little doodle like these cool folks here who I want to shout out before the end of the video for once because their support means the world to me. Thank you so much. There'll be a little bit more info on the Patreon at the end of the video, but for now, let's move on to our next manga. Now for a complete change of pace with a work from perhaps the most famous mangaka ever, Osamu Tezuka. Tezuka is a figure who I've pretty much neglected despite my overwhelming love and interest for manga as an art form. I've barely touched his works though, and I'd wager what I know about him and his works is only a drop in the bucket. A bucket of blood, that is, because we have to stay on theme. I was pretty happy to find then that Tezuka had done a manga featuring vampires, and when I saw the goofy design of Don Dracula on the cover, I knew I had to check it out. Like, how could you not want to read this after looking at this fun Dracula dude?
Shit ain't nothing to me, man. I'll kill you, you stupid.
Don Dracula would begin as a series within Weekly Shonen Champion in 1979, a good few years after the Poe Clan, and wouldn't be anything like it, as you can probably tell. It would follow Count Dracula as well as his daughter Chocola as they live their lives in Japan after moving from Transylvania, and is a gag comedy focusing on the inherent silliness that comes from this premise. Like Dracula and Chocula going to hunt for a pretty lady's blood, but having to climb 17 stories to get to an apartment as they live in a metropolitan area now, and Dracula doesn't handle stairs very well. Another really funny instance is Dracula making instant ramen because he couldn't successfully get any blood. The intertwining of classic monster in modern day setting leads to some great little gags like this. Slapstick also pops up a lot as well, like when Dracula gets turned to ash, so Chocula vacuums him up to put him back together again. There's also a bit of a rawness or a black comedy vibe to certain elements, like how Carmilla pops up at one point, Chocula's mother, but Dracula and her got divorced years back, prompting a fight between the two. Divorce is a heavy subject, but I found this reveal really funny because of how out of left field it was. It also helps highlight some of the humanity Don Dracula has, which comes across in the relationship between Dracula and Chocula. Dracula is a bumbling buffoon. He may not be the best dad, but he does care deeply about Chocula and wants the best for her. The two's personalities work really well together too, since Chocula is by far the more composed and capable of the two. Goofy dad and daughter who has her shit together is such a fun combo that this one pulls off really well. I'm sure everything has been said ever about Tezuka's approach to drawing and art style, but I love how this looks. Tezuka has such a command of a manga, which makes sense since he practically invented it. I will not be arguing the semantics about that in the comments with anyone, by the way. In particular, it's all the expressions the characters make that elevate the manga. They're so goofy. Dracula's unique facial structure, his big nose and eyebrows make way for hundreds of funny faces which greatly aid visual gags. I also want to praise his cape and overall blackness. Him just being in a scene immediately makes it pop due to the black-white contrast his design presents. I definitely recommend taking a peep at this as it's pretty cute, although only a handful of chapters have been translated. If you want more though, an 8-episode anime from 1982 exists, which I've skimmed through a bit, and while it doesn't look like the best thing in the world, it still retains the silliness and some of the charm of the manga, so perhaps check that out too. Kyuuketsu Kuromajo introduces us to yet another big author in Hideshi Hino, and surprise surprise, I also have very little experience with him. This whole video basically turned into a big excuse for me to explore all these high profile manga authors. While he may not be well known outside of Japan compared to someone like Junji Ito, it seems Hino has had a very prolific career, and even talking to people who know of him, they hadn't heard of this work in particular, which is one of his earlier ones. It follows Aya Hanamura, a student who excels at pretty much everything and is widely loved amongst her classmates and family, but one day something calls to her as she's walking back from school. An orb. Its gleaming form mesmerizes her and she's prompted to take it, but every night since then she has wild nightmares where she's transported to a feudal Japanese castle, decrepit, dank, and cold. Kyuuketsu Kuromajo is one of the most different of all the works I'll be touching on today, in part because its vampires lack a lot of traditional Western elements and the setting is decidedly Japanese. Mysticism is also pretty prevalent here with the magic orb, the dreams, and the overall tone of the work. These smoky lines often appear, the sounds of bells is prevalent too, which creates an atmosphere unlike the other works. It's not funny like Don Dracula or as drama-filled as the Poe Clan, as it instead focuses on supernatural horror. All in all, it's a pretty simple story. It's only 1 volume long, and it lets the art do a lot of the work, with most pages only being comprised of a few panels. The establishing panels as well as the scarier page turns make it an enjoyable read though. What I think is most interesting about it is its approach to vampires, and not only in the sense that they've been imbued with a more Japanese spiritual side. In contrast to pretty much all vampires we'll see today, these ones are without a doubt monsters. Their humanity is greatly subdued and they want you to be spooked by them. But a separate horror element exists here too, a gendered one. There is one aspect of the Poe Clan I actually neglected to mention earlier, which I will be discussing, and it's the decision to have the protagonists be young male vampires. Hajio used young male vampire characters to explore specific issues which might have been difficult for female readers to digest if they were confronted directly. So like how vampires act as a surrogate or stopgap to explore complex ethical and human issues, Hajio implemented an extra layer to that to potentially safeguard younger female readers. This isn't to say girls are incapable of exploring complex themes directly, or humans can't handle those themes directly, but that a certain amount of obfuscation, of establishing an other, can help us sympathize and view things from another angle before attributing those themes to ourselves. One of the extra bits of research I did for this video was reading a paper called Everlasting Life, Everlasting Loneliness, The Genealogy of the Poe Clan by Satoko Kan, which delved into some of the gendered aspects of the Poe Clan and provided me with some additional context to the time period when it was serialized. But what it primed in me was the thought of vampires being depicted as a predatory force. As much as I like to romanticize them, initial vampire works like Dracula present the vampire as a predator, not just in a monster sense, but a sexual one too. If we can ignore some nuance, we can summarize Dracula as a much older, powerful man, specifically looking for younger virgin girls to exsanguinate. This manga features a Japanese version of this, a black castle, the lord of that castle and their lackeys, who are all grotesque older men who are specifically seeking a virginal youth to drain of their vigor. I'm not really qualified or educated enough to tackle this subject in a ton of detail, but I'm aware enough to see the potential horror that vampires can convey in this gendered sense. Kyuuketsu Majou shows the patriarchal vampire then, one that draws a portion of its horror from a real-world place. Alongside the fear of the supernatural, of being in an unfamiliar place, the sexual fear of being predated on by older men is here too. The previously mentioned article dives into this idea and explains things in a much more concise and well-written way than I ever could, by highlighting how the Poe Clan opts to tell a vampire story without these potentially real elements of gendered horror. It's a fascinating read and I'll link it down below. Kyuuketsu Majou then acts as a good example of how vampires can be used solely for horror. They don't have to be part of a grand dramatic tale or be deconstructed for comedy. Sometimes vampires are just monsters. Returning to drama and vampires, Akuma no Juusan-ya is another shoujo vampire story starting in 1986, which I think has taken some obvious inspiration from the Poe Clan, and thus we're back to some more Western-styled vampires. Following a girl called Madeline as she moves into a mansion in the country along with her little brother Dion and their mother, over the course of 2 volumes, this tells a slow burn horror story as Madeline gets acquainted to the local town, makes friends and falls in love, but in the background something sinister is happening. People have been disappearing here and there, just like the mysterious killings of Jack the Ripper in London. What this manga does differently though is early on you find out it's Madeline's mother who's been doing these killings as she is a vampire. Instead of her killing her daughter or vice versa, Madeline keeps this dark secret hidden, helping her mother as she can't bear to let go of her. What this spawns is not only a horror story but a suspenseful thriller, as mother and daughter try to hide multiple murders and vampiric activity from the town as well as Dion, the little brother. I found it really novel as I hadn't seen a story like this where a human character was protecting a vampire relative, especially a parent. It leads to some very neat story developments as well as emotional beats, as familial love is at the core of this story. If you take the approach of analysing it through the lens of a vampire being an analogy for an outsider, it also presents a story of a child accepting their parents for who they are and helping them keep that secret for the benefit of their relationship and family. Remove the vampire aspect entirely and killings, and the mother is a single woman who owns vast wealth who sneaks off to London to meet random men. There's subtext there which I find really interesting. Her predicament, her being unmarried and wealthy at this time period, probably is enough for a lot of townsfolk to dislike her or think she's a witch just because she leads a different life. All of this and the trauma associated with it passes on to Madeline too, who bears the weight of her mother in multiple ways throughout the story, leading to a pretty tragic ending. This is a relatively unread work, which I think is brilliant. It exhibits many themes we've come across already, like vampires being outsiders, but also interweaves familial elements in too. Often these come up in stories of found family among vampires, but in works like this and Don Dracula, the parental figures often rely on the support of their children. The relationship dynamics are a bit atypical, which is perfectly fitting as pretty much everything attributed to vampires socially is atypical as well. Akuma no Juusan-ya is also short, has very pretty artwork, and I've tried to be a bit deliberately vague as I think this is one that should be read by a whole lot more people. Interview with the Vampire remains one of the most well-known and popular pieces of vampire cinema, but did you know in the same year it was released, it also received a manga adaptation, or the Anne Rice book also received a manga adaptation coinciding with the film. There's also some author's notes at the back of its single short volume about its creation, but I'm not even sure it was planned as a tie-in or anything, despite it pretty much covering the contents of the film. I expected this to be more of a curio than anything else, but surprisingly, I enjoyed this adaptation of the story, and it affected me despite being so short, as well as give me some more appreciation for the film and its themes. I think the two major things I want to discuss surrounding it are one, its artwork and how similar certain elements are to the Poe Clan. On the art front, some of its Bishi designs for Lestat and Louis look kinda goofy at points, and I mean this in an endearing way, but other times they're really well drawn. I can't help but love their hair and facial expressions. Claudia, though, is the star of the show. I love how she's depicted, with a great mix of cute and absolute goblin. The artist Udo Shinohara has a good grasp on drawing fanged expressions and glaring eyes. On the subject of Claudia, the Poe Clan attempted to explore similar ideas with Brodel and the overall story of Edgar. The themes of loneliness, of never aging, bizarre found family permeate both works, and I find it interesting that both the Poe Clan from 1972 and Anne Rice's original novel for Interview with the Vampire in 1976 would arrive at similar ideas despite the author's cultures being so different. I don't really know when certain elements of vampire stories were codified, but I'd like to think that this is a showcase of how vampires naturally lead to these types of humanistic stories full of existential and ethical questions. Now, this next one is the other big manga I wanted to talk about in length besides the Poe Clan, and in a lot of ways I think it plays with opposing ideas and tones. It is also by far the least accessible due to its content, and while I can stomach it, a lot of people won't be able to. Laughing Vampire by Suehiro Maruo is an Eroguro manga that is not for the faint of heart. If you can't handle discussion on themes like sexual abuse, violence, gore, etc., you might want to skip this part, though I do think it will be interesting to discuss, and it represents the other side of the coin from the prettier and more delicate tragedies as well as goofy comedies we've gone through thus far. If the Poe Clan is a work exploring the beautiful but tragic existence of vampires, and through that an exploration of life, its briefness, the sadness and grief we experience, but also the precious elements and memories we find due to its ephemerality, then Laughing Vampire presents its bleaker sibling. While Japan has myths and yokai similar to vampires, they're a creature not native to their region, not existing in Japan prior to World War II, and as such they're an invasive cultural concept. A Western monster which through shoujo manga would be pacified largely into something beautiful and tragic. Laughing Vampire then begins with the aftermath of that very war, described as a day that dawned like the end of the world and nothing could be done about it. In this fragile post-war state, all sorts of horrors occurred, and it would make sense that anyone deemed other would be a target, persecuted and pushed out, which is the case for this elderly vampire at the beginning of our story who locals call Onibaba, who they hanged and left for dead. Laughing Vampire grounds itself in the real horrors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the chaos post the Second World War to present a world that has ended, one of hopelessness, full of vice, death, and depravity. In a word, it's hell. Vampire stories often explore the existential and sometimes dip into the nihilistic, the philosophy that our existence is pointless, but we are free to make of it what we want. While other stories we've covered see characters attempt to find meaning in a world they do not belong in, Laughing Vampire sees the cruelty of humanity produce vampires that thrive in a world of violence, one where our carnality is left uncaged. The Japan of Laughing Vampire is a dog-eat-dog world, one where nobody is safe, that has no trouble depicting its citizens given to deviance, where plenty injure, abuse, kill, or rape indiscriminately. It primarily follows two young vampires though, Konosuke Mori, a schoolboy turned by the Onibaba mentioned earlier, as well as Luna, a girl isolated and confused at the violent and hypersexual world around her. Building from what I mentioned earlier with Kyuuketsu Kuromajo, the horror on display, especially in Luna's segments, is one of a sexual nature, but in this case it's unrestrained and fully showed to us. The first few chapters illustrate well how afraid she is of men and their sexual advances. She hates the fact her breasts have grown and has a visceral reaction whenever sex is brought up, as well as when she sees her sister pregnant. It's then she gets taken and sexually assaulted, and Maruo doesn't shy away from showing us everything, but in particular it's made clear how dirty and unclean everything is. It likes to use insects, once with ants crawling on Luna's thigh, and then a centipede appears post her rape. I think this is representative to a lot. Like I just mentioned, it has connotations of something being unclean. Many people have phobias of insects too, perhaps relating that to Luna's sexual aversion. I think a lot of people would read Laughing Vampire and approach it as the most fucked up manga of all time, or seek its taboo content for vapid surface level reasons, but it's clear it's trying to convey how horrible this event was for this particular character. The crawling, gnawing association of insects running across her skin, to me that's how Maruo is trying to convey to us how Luna feels. And this is done in a visceral and sensory way through the use of these insects. They could also represent corruption, the loss of innocence, which is also being tackled here, and not just through Luna but with other major characters too, like Konosuke and Soto, who is another child who commits extremely violent acts out of mere curiosity to see what he can get away with. The background school children too are also shown falling into depravity, taking drugs, committing acts of violence and sexual perversion. As it was stated in the beginning, the world has ended, the bombs have been dropped and society has been reduced to a cruel, corrupt husk. And this is where vampirism comes in. It's freedom, it's accepting that everything around you is fucked, that nothing matters, so why not be the one who does what you want, who commits violence to everyone else. It's a perverted escape, but it's the only escape that this world offers. It allows Luna to at least take revenge on the one who defiled her and live without fear, but it costs her the humanity and innocence she has, symbolized when she gives her sister's child to the Onibaba. To contrast the two biggest manga in this video in the Poe Clan, we observe that vampires must live eternally despite the pain. They are beautiful in their purity and keep their childish innocence intact at the cost of being rejected by society. Laughing Vampire then sees life in general as eternal hell, which nothing can be done about. Society and its horrors will consume all, but vampirism is the key to some sort of freedom, allowing vampires to reject society at the cost of their childhood and innocence. The way both provide an exploration into the existence of vampires, why they exist while contrasting and being so different, is why I love vampire stories in a nutshell. They're so versatile, putting these two side by side is proof of that. Another aspect of vampire stories I wanted to tackle here is how these works often feature narratives surrounding imbalances of power, of superiority and submission. As mentioned earlier with Kyuuketsu Kuromajo, you can use this to amplify the real-world horror young girls might feel, but it's something present in almost all vampire media. Usually when a vampire turns another, they will be their parental figure or their master. They take responsibility over them, but they usually have dominance over them too, and in some cases a story's vampire mythology might not even include a character becoming a vampire after being turned, but a ghoul or some kind of lesser servant instead. Then there's the differences in status and age for vampires. Often vamps are rich counts, they possess vast wealth or are thousands of years old. This often creates big power dynamics between protagonist characters or any human who comes across them. This is present in everything we've talked about today. The Poe Clan seeks to strip itself from this idea the most, I think, but Edgar ends up turning Alan with them having a clear dynamic of one relying on the other, and Edgar's initial risky transformation is at the hands of a much older vampire. Don Dracula humorously inverts the father-daughter dynamic though, seeing the daughter be the one more in control, which is fitting for a comedy manga poking fun and deconstructing vampiric ideas. Interview with a Vampire might share this idea the most, with Lestat's clear dominance over Louis and the turning of Claudia being prime examples of one character putting another into a position of submission. And Kyuuketsu Majou has the evil vampire lord over its protagonist through supernatural magics, while them also being a much older patriarchal figure. Most often, humans are at the vampire's mercy and they can't do much about it. In the instance of Laughing Vampire, it explores this idea through its hyperviolence and the depravity inflicted by almost all of its characters. It posits that it's better to be the victimizer than the victim in its nihilistic hell world. To hurt, to kill, to rape, to express your power and superiority over others is proof that you are alive. And in an ironic twist, this makes the vampires of Laughing Vampire the most alive ones of all. I called some of the shoujo manga I mentioned in this video beautiful artistically, and I pointed out the floral imagery that aids all of this. Despite me putting these works at odds with Laughing Vampire thematically and tonally, I also find it captivatingly beautiful, and it uses the same floral imagery and type of symbolism. It juxtaposes its extreme brutality with this imagery to make pages that are haunting, horrible, but also intoxicating. So much goes into its full page illustrations, little details, and fantastic compositions. I already mentioned the symbolism and usage of insects earlier, but there's so much more like this. Like this fireworks scene where Konosuke turns Luna into a vampire. It's celebratory, explosive, it's the birth of new life, despite the scene surrounding it being putrid. It's possibly the single most good thing that happens in the manga despite its later ramifications, as it saves Luna from dying in an alleyway alone. And one that's used in conjunction with the context of the narrative to produce a fascinating image. While being the most innocent part of the manga in a sense, it leads into corruption, corrupting an iconic, typically romantic and innocent scene you'd see from any other romance series, the fireworks kiss scene. An earlier picture that does something similar is of Konosuke in the middle of some train tracks, surrounded by flowers. It's almost like two lovers have found an idyllic place to make love together here, but instead, as we zoom in, it's Konosuke feeding, blood drenching his lips, the woman's dead face contrasting the flowers and butterflies that fill the panel. There's beauty in this brutality and the contrast of everything here. So much of Laughing Vampire is foul, it's disorienting, it's a nightmare, and panels contort and break into weird squares, naturalistic imagery splatters pages alongside blood. The way Maro depicts time by showing after images of heads or eyes further adds to the bizarre quality the manga has. I find it so focused on the moment though, what's happening scene by scene. It's a manga that's alive, and it's a manga about being alive, in a perpetual state of constant movement and violence. In stark contrast to the Poe Clan, which is methodical, it plods along with monologues and wants you to think, leaping in intermittent order from past to future. Laughing Vampire instead is now. Page after page, it's living inside a broken world, while its contemporaries are reminiscing about it. I think what it has to say about life, about living in each moment and each moment being potentially hell, is fascinating. It feels like someone is screaming at you constantly, that they're just in pain, and I love the emotions this manga can exhibit. There is so much to Laughing Vampire, and I've barely even touched its second half, Paradise, as well as the journeys of its other characters. What I will say is, I think it was a great way for me into Suehiro Maruo's works and Eroguro. What's on display here is not wanton violence with no meaning, but something you can extract a significant amount of depth from. My love of vampires has only aided me in seeing beyond the surface level atrocities it depicts. If I were more historically inclined, I'd probably discuss more on the state of Japan post-World War II and the changing social sphere of the country. Clearly it primes you for that with this introduction, but at least for now I lack knowledge in that area, and I had other aspects I wanted to discuss more. I highly recommend reading it though if you'd like to dip into something different, transgressive, or see a work from one of manga's greatest underground artists. Moving on, we have a few smaller works to chill out with before the video ends, and this next one actually began before Laughing Vampire, being from 1997, but tonally I think we need something to wind down, so let's check out something completely different with COWA by Akira Toriyama. If this video didn't have a star-studded cast of mangaka already, it definitely does now, with Toriyama being well known for Dragon Ball as well as Dr. Slump, but he's also done a large body of shorter works outside of these juggernauts. He isn't a stranger to vampires either, as they pop up throughout his work, with me really loving Trampire from Dr. Slump specifically. She's super cute. Toriyama generally doesn't focus on vampires solely, but rather monsters, as if a vampire is present, chances are they'll be followed closely by other characters inspired by classic ghoulies. I feel Hammer horror might be a big influence here. And COWA is no exception to this, as it's more of a silly monster manga than a vampire one, but it's a work that's from an author that people love but might not be familiar with. Plus, look at how cute the artwork is. How could I not yap about this for a bit? Paifu, our main character here, is an adorable yet silly little vampire cross koala who goes around doing things monster kids usually do. It's silly, very charming, and has a sprinkling of dark humor. My favorite aspects of it are just how childish it is, like seeing Paifu and friends be grossed out by anything good, like cupids, love, or rainbows. These things scare them, which is very cute. If I can connect it to anything thematic wise in this video, it's the idea that even if you're an outsider, people will still sometimes be willing to help you, or you can connect with others who don't quite fit in, like with the ex-human wrestler Mako, who helps Paifu and friends throughout the manga. Vampires, though, for as much depth as they can have, can also be goofy, silly, blood-sucking monsters, so if you want something more light-hearted after reading a manga like Laughing Vampire, or if you want to explore Akira Toriyama's work beyond Dragon Ball, this is a great little manga to try out. And to finish up, we have another big Shonen Jump author, as well as a good friend of Akira Toriyama's in Masakazu Katsura with his one-shot Dr.Chanbelee. This one takes us back to something a bit more contemplative and explores the plight of the vampire's existence once more. Grail Chambelee is a wandering vampire that lives a hollow existence, having lost family and purpose. He is a pretty archetypal vampire. Alongside his loneliness, it's made out how insignificant the time passing is within the manga and how much Chanbelee wishes to die, a fate that surrounds a lot of vampires, including those we've discussed today. The existential nihilism inherent with the lives of vampires is palpable but very human, and I think through their stories we can hold a mirror to us to help us find meaning in our own lives. Dr.Chanbelee gives us a story of found purpose through its titular main character discovering that he has the ability to heal, devoting his undeath to helping the living. If life has no meaning, if there's nothing you want to do or can do, then perhaps serving others, assisting them, healing them, maybe that's a path you can take to give meaning to your own existence. Alongside this, Dr.Chanbelee presents another reason to keep existing, the passing on of the torch. When we think of that alongside vampires, we think of vampirism itself being passed down, the curse cyclically continuing, with the second character in this one-shot wishing for just that, to heal her pain as she's on her deathbed. But instead, through great effort, the doctor cures her, and doesn't pass on his vampirism, but instead ends up inspiring her to become a doctor herself. Due to the constrained page count, Dr.Chanbelee doesn't express this with much grace, but it's a nice little story that I feel touches on many interesting elements associated with vampires. It's also quite different again, like all the other manga we've covered. Vampires are extremely varied as a creature and the stories they inhabit. Their legacy is rich and a joy to explore as you can tackle them in so many different ways. They present a perfect canvas to explore a myriad of difficult topics like existentialism, loneliness, sexual identity, and preference. And I love them for that, for holding up a dark mirror to ourselves and presenting us with stories that challenge our very being in an intimate and emotional way. I love vampires. I think I've made that very clear throughout this video, and I hope if you're watching up until now, you might also feel the same or be interested in trying out something new, be it a manga I've covered today or something else entirely. From the sheer amount of vampire media available and the articles I've cited, it's clear that a lot of other people have a lot to say about them as well. I find a lot of artists have short works or one-shots covering vampires, including some of my favorites like Tsubasa Yamaguchi, the author of Blue Period, who has their own vampire story called Kamiya, or Hirohiko Araki with Phantom Blood. Tatsuki Fujimoto also has Goodbye Ari, another one of my favorite authors. And I'm sure there's a lot more out there by authors I like or haven't even yet met, so I'd love to do this again. Maybe for some more modern vampire media, maybe for older stuff as well, as I did have a look and there's still a lot of vampire manga I've yet to read. Also, feel free to tell me what vampire media you like and what vampires might mean to you on a thematic level. It doesn't have to be just from manga alone, by the way. It could be anime, film, comics, books, etc. I adore vampires on a conceptual level and would love to experience more media featuring them, especially if it's very good. For now, I think I've said all I wanted to about manga and vampires. I hope you enjoyed, and I hope you stick around for future videos. I usually talk about Weekly Shonen Jump, its history, and manga magazines in general, but sometimes I branch out to other manga, and I'd like to continue making videos like this about topics I'm interested in, using manga as a medium for exploration. On the topic of Shonen Jump, if you like older or more obscure manga, the History of Shonen Jump series I've made features me going through the magazine chronologically from its beginning in 1968, which you might enjoy if you like this video. I also have a video on Akira Toriyama and Masakazu Katsura, the authors of COWA and Dr.Chanbelee, as they were both good friends with each other. I find it really nice they both made little vampire works around the same time too. If you really enjoyed this and would like to help support me though, subscribing, liking, and sharing the video would be a big help, as well as supporting me on Patreon if you're able. For $1 a month, you'll get access to a few exclusive videos I've made of behind the scenes stuff, some polls related to Axed manga, and at the $3 tier, you'll even get a unique little doodle drawn by me, like the following cool people: Kinocha, Jade, Kaizoku Gairu, Sorocool Zero, Holly the Apothecary, Majou, It's Fako, Yellowtail, Lay Sloggett, Chris P. Bacon, Joe Henshin, Full Metal, Unquestionable, Weepy Boy, Wuzzle, Violent, Cactus, Joni, City Name E, Vina Burrito, Caffeine Dad, Cryonaut, Crash, and also AB, Bakodraws, Otaku Gamer X, Deadpan, Shy Monkeys, Jonathan Dragonet, John Sanford, and Color at the $1 tier. Thank you all so much for being patrons, and as always, thank you so much for watching. Remember to be kind and take care.
Hello, yes, may I come in your house? Thank you.
I'm a vampire. You shouldn't have done that.
Hey, how are you?